Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. An important theme of this show is the role of rhetoric in politics. It's not just the arguments we make that matter, but when we choose to make them and how we talk about political issues. And we can learn a lot about the people who disagree with us, not just by parsing their arguments, but by paying attention to when and how they make them. This is critically important in a political environment as charged, fraught, and arguably on the brink as ours in the days before a presidential election. And the fact is, with the acute threat from the right to the very foundations of our liberal, open, and democratic society, much of our journalism has fallen into a particularly worrying rhetoric, one that downplays these threats while stirring up resentment towards vulnerable groups. I can't think of anyone better to talk with about these issues central to our political life than Parker Molloy. She's a Chicago-based writer and author of the indispensable The Present Age, a newsletter about communication in a hyper-connected world. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported project. If you like the show and want to get early access to new episodes, consider becoming a supporter. You can learn more and sign up for the free newsletter companion to this podcast by heading to reimaginingliberty.com. And stick around to the end of today's episode for a preview of my next discussion, available now in early access for supporters. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Parker. On your newsletter, you recently wrote about the New York Times coverage of a Moms for Liberty event that Trump spoke at. And in reading it, it raised a lot of broader concerns and broader issues that have been playing out in the media in DC, in the way that we as Americans, as political participants, and then those of us who are among kind of the political elite, talk about political issues. So I thought we'd start there. Can you tell us about what this event was and what the New York Times said about it?
Sure, absolutely. So this was the Moms for Liberty's annual Joyful Warriors Summit, which is just their annual summit, and they tend to have politicians speaking at this. And last year, I believe they had Ron DeSantis. Trump was speaking there this year, and just the way that this story opened was really interesting to me. The way that the New York Times talked about this as it opened up, because they gave you an idea of what the room was like: trays of mini cupcakes, squadrons of helicopter moms, buzzed off white wine. You know, it painted a picture of just kind of a bunch of moms hanging out, having a good time, listening to Trump talk. But that's not exactly who Moms for Liberty are. You know, Moms for Liberty, as people may know, they're the group behind a lot of these book bans, a lot of the anti-diversity, anti-DEI movement, very anti-LGBTQ, and the way that they were presented in this particular article was did not exactly shine a light on that.
So what's going on here? I mean, so Moms for Liberty is, I don't think it's controversial or all that debatable to call them a hate organization. They're one of the most vocal and prominent, and in terms of just ongoing damage that they do to vulnerable people, one of the worst in the country. They are arguably a fascist or proto-fascist organization. So these are really, really bad people inflicting real harms. And so it is striking to describe them that way. And it's striking in a way that demands explanation. So why is it, like the New York Times, my guess is most of the people at the New York Times are not of the variety of the far right that Moms for Liberty represents. They're like mainstream journalists, probably most of them vote for Democrats and so on. They would not think of themselves that way. And yet, the behavior of describing the far right in these kinds of euphemistic, watered down, or dismissive of the harm that they do terms is persistent, conspicuously so. So, what do you think's going on?
Well, I think that part of it is that the things that Moms for Liberty are against, the causes that they take up, are a lot of these, so-called culture war issues that I think mainstream journalists try to push aside, generally speaking. They try to set those aside. Like that's just one side of this, and we're not gonna treat that as extreme, no matter how actually extreme these positions are. And so I think that plays a role into it, where being anti-LGBTQ is not necessarily seen as extreme to a reporter who maybe doesn't care, isn't personally affected by anti-LGBTQ rhetoric or actions, anti-black, efforts to ban books about Martin Luther King. If you're not part of the affected group, if you're not part of the targeted group, it might be easy to kind of overlook that. But one of the things that I did in this piece that I wrote was I just kind of listed a bunch of headlines from Media Matters for America, which a place I worked for 3 years, and just going through those, looking at 2021 to 2024, it's kind of they're more extreme than I even remembered. Looking at this, it was oh, they have ties to the anti-civil rights movement. The fact that there's such a thing as the anti-civil rights movement is absolutely wild to me. Moms for Liberty leader threatens gun violence against librarians and newly leaked audio. They've helped pass anti-LGBTQ bills, and that stuff didn't really come up in this New York Times article. The one time that the New York Times, the closest thing that the New York Times did that got to a criticism was they said that the Moms for Liberty can get a bit carried away, and cited the time one of its chapters accidentally quoted Hitler. And it wasn't an accident. They attributed the quote to Hitler in this newsletter. They very clearly knew who they were quoting with this, and the Times had to go back and issue a correction, saying an earlier version of this article incorrectly said a local chapter of Moms for Liberty had accidentally quoted Adolf Hitler in a newsletter. The group, which later issued an apology, was aware that the quote was from Hitler when the newsletter was published. And as another Media Matters article found, that wasn't even the first time that Moms for Liberty had used that exact Hitler quote, which is, he alone who owns the youth gains the future, apparently. It's just wild that these extremists, I think it's fair to call them extremists, that they're just treated as a group of your average conservative suburban women. And maybe that says something about how the Times views conservative suburban women. But I think that that's probably an unfair generalization on their part. So it could kind of speak to this sort of bubble that reporters are in, where there's a group, its name is Moms for Liberty. They are very loud and very influential. But I doubt that they represent the ideas that your average, suburban, conservative women voter, believes. And I'd hope so, at least, because that's their views are pretty intense.
I think the bubble is an important point here. because the harm that a group like Moms for Liberty inflicts is not happening in the places where New York Times reporters live, primarily. I mean, there are some who are outside of the New York DC corridor, but most of them are in that. And you're not having book bans in DC, which is the bluest of blue places you can be. You're not having them in New York, which is quite blue. And so I think the members of marginalized communities that they know personally in their geographic bubbles aren't feeling the harm from a group like Moms for Liberty the way that if you lived in Florida or Alabama or Idaho or wherever else, you feel it. And so I think there's that. And I also think, and this is from, I lived for a dozen years in DC and worked in public policy in DC and hung out with a lot of journalists and columnists for the Washington Post and other places, is I think the lack of representation by these targeted groups within their spheres. So there aren't many trans journalists at the New York Times or Washington Post. And as a result, I think there's this real sense in these communities that we, the elite journalists, are the serious people. We're the ones, our circles are the thoughtful thought leaders on these issues. And so people outside of that, journalists who aren't with these major organizations or independent writers, or activists, which are seen as ultimately lesser than, the inside the beltway view, are themselves a kind of unserious extremist. And so if they're telling us we're getting this wrong, if they're telling us this is a bigger deal than we think it is, we being these journalists can kind of dismiss that, because if these people were really serious, if they were thoughtful and educated and knew their field and were the top of their game, they'd be working with us. They'd be in our elite circles. But because they're not, they're as fringy as maybe Moms for Liberty is. And so we can kind of not listen to them, which then reinforces. I mean, it obviously makes it harder for representation to happen if you kind of have defined a certain group of people as fundamentally unserious. But I think there's genuinely this sense that it can't be that big of a deal because people like me don't see it as that big of a deal.
And you know what, like to that point, I think that it was last year, 2023, when a group of people who had contributed to the New York Times over the years, wrote to the paper to say, your coverage of trans issues has been bad. It just it hasn't. You haven't quoted trans people in stories about trans issues. You haven't the obsession that you have with certain topics, certain aspects of being trans, especially related to healthcare, is outweighs the actual amount of actual news coming out about this issue. And the Times just ignored it. And the Times pushed back on it, saying it was from a group of activists. And I was one of the people who signed that letter because I've had a couple things published by the paper. And it's frustrating to be labeled an activist, because I happen to be trans, and so that it does affect me personally. But because of that, I think that I hear this a lot, where I'll be doing some writing some media criticism, which is just kind of what I do, and people will be like, so you're an activist. And I'm like, I'm not an activist. If I write about trans issues, especially, that it gets looked at through this lens of, well, Parker's clearly an activist because this affects her personally. And, I think that kind of, it comes back to this idea of the default, the neutral being, straight, white, cisgender man. That is what's considered neutral. Anything else, anything outside that, if it's a person of color who's criticizing race coverage, well, they're clearly just an activist, or they can't be objective because this affects them personally. But news affects all of us, and if anything, people who are directly affected by these things have just as much authority to speak on them as those who aren't. And it's kind of weird that we romanticize this idea of journalists being so separated from on the ground, this view from nowhere kind of journalism, where it's, I'm detached, I'm just observing, I'm just watching, and I don't have any skin in the game, that sort of idea. And I think that until journalists can kind of get past that, until they can start to start to incorporate a wider range of voices, then I don't think that we're going to really see much improvement on that, because, as you said, these things don't affect them directly, and the people in these communities who they know aren't necessarily being directly affected either. I live in Chicago. A lot of the anti-LGBTQ laws haven't directly affected my life because I'm in Chicago. So I'm kind of protected from that for the moment. And I think that might give someone who is not me, who knows me, might be like, well, Parker seems like she's doing okay. So clearly it must not be that bad. While in my mind, I'm looking at what's happening, and on the anti-LGBTQ, specifically anti-trans kind of movement, and it scares me. It does have an effect on me. So I think that's another aspect of this, where you have to kind of look at the people who might not seem to be bothered by things that are happening, things that are changing, might deep down see this and just sort of try to block it out. So that's another, thing here. I with the trans coverage, there was some pushback from people who would say, well, my trans friend said that this is fine. I have a trans friend, that sort of thing, where, you just come up with excuses, and you use one-off, examples of people to say, see, this is fine, I got permission.
And I think that actually raises a way that the situation is worse than what you described, because it is not. So yes, there is this, I can be dismissive of this group of people who are writing about this issue because that issue impacts them directly, and so therefore they're activists. And of course, that's an inconsistently applied standard, because journalists write about issues that have salience in their own lives all of the time, and we don't dismiss them for that. But I think the other thing that it frequently causes is a willingness to elevate contrarianism because it's contrary. And so if it is the case that, say, all of the people who are arguing strongly against the way the New York Times presents transgender issues are transgender, or a significant portion of them, and so therefore they're activists, and so therefore they're biased, unreliable, not worthy of taking seriously, then that means that the position that they're setting out is ultimately wrong. And what that means is that the trans person who says, actually, the New York Times coverage is correct, actually, the science does say all this stuff that, and I think this is an important point in talking about, I just want to highlight in talking about specifically transgender issues, is it's not just that the New York Times editorial page's position on this stuff is ethically or morally wrong, but that it just constantly gets the basic science and data wrong. It cites studies that have been retracted, had mistakes in analysis. It's just bad reporting in addition to being bad ethics. But because of all that, there's a rush to believe that whoever is among these groups but has the courage to speak against the consensus view of the activists that's like a thumb on the epistemic scale for the truth of their position. And you see this play out too with people on the right highlighting women who will say, actually, these feminist concerns are junk, or highlighting members of different racial minorities who are like, actually, racism isn't real. It's if we can find someone who, and I don't think it's just finding someone who agrees with me and we're naturally inclined to believe someone who agrees with us. I think it is seeing them as courageous contrarians against the activist consensus and then not looking into whether their arguments are any good.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean that I think, we've seen that across, across issues that do go outside of the culture war. You look at how the climate science. You would have people who deny climate change. They get a large platform for denying, for going against the grain. That you get rewarded for being a contrarian, and I think that happens a lot today. When it comes to literally any topic, especially when you look at, for instance, I mean, there was the editor at NPR who earlier this year came out and was like, NPR has a liberal bias and they shut down conservative voices and all of this. That guy went on to become kind of a celebrity on the right, because he was seen as speaking truth to power. And no matter how much people on the inside of NPR said, actually, what he's saying it doesn't quite match up with reality. You saw mainstream papers, New York Times, Washington Post, and so on, treating his essentially it was a blog post as this document that must be true because it went against the grain. And I think that by incentivizing going against the grain, which isn't necessarily, it's not necessarily a bad thing to go against consensus if that's what you believe, but the fact is that social media rewards people for having takes that go against the grain. Newspapers reward people who have opinions that go against the grain. For instance, the last time the New York Times published anything of mine was right after Twitter implemented a ban on dead naming and misgendering trans people. And the whole idea of that policy, which since Elon Musk took over has since been rescinded, was that you couldn't just find a trans person and respond to them directly saying, your name is actually this, and your name is this, and you're a man, and you're a man, like all of this over and over. Just, it was about targeted harassment, not a broad rule of what could be said on the website. Now, the reason that the Times published my piece was because I pitched it with a contrarian angle, because I know that if I want to get published by the New York Times, I have to pitch something with an angle that goes kind of against the grain. So I pitched it as how this new policy actually makes free speech better, and how limiting speech makes free speech better. And they went for it. And, I think I made a strong argument in the piece, but it's kind of a shame that you have to find this approach that is going to make people angry, and it's going to make readers want to hate share it and go, see how wrong this is. Look at this bad headline. Look at this bad take, or use it to bolster their own views. and that is something that, Barry Weiss, who used to work for the New York Times, but then she started her own publication. She used to find people on Twitter, takes that she just sort of generally agreed with, and would reach out to them and go, do you want to write a piece about this? And that's something that editors do kind of, or used to do more on Twitter. And, really, it's editors at these publications finding people who can act as their stand-ins, who already share their views to get out there.
An aspect of that, of highlighting the contrarianness and of presenting yourself as speaking truth to power, which is very much say what Barry Weiss's The Free Press does, is it presents itself as saying the things they don't want you to hear in a courageous way, when in fact it is just the most basic of center-right conventional wisdom. I remember there was that piece several years ago in The Atlantic about these dinner parties of contrarians who imagined, it was presented as like, these are the people who are getting together to have the conversations that you're not allowed to have and speak the truths that you're not allowed to speak. But then when they actually quoted like what these people were talking about, it was just what like everybody at the New York Times or Washington Post or in DC policy circles or wherever already believes. They just had imagined themselves. But part of that is convincing yourself that if you say this, people will jump on you. People will get angry at you. You can't say this kind of stuff, and therefore I'm courageous in presenting it. And I think about this a lot in debates about trans issues. One of the things that's really striking to me is how many people who have some concerns about transgender healthcare or its use with children, or not in a hateful way, but they just have some worries, are convinced that they can't even have those conversations, because if they do, if they ask a transgender person, they will get verbally attacked, canceled, destroyed, that you can, which is crazy because like this podcast, I've had multiple conversations with transgender people about transgender issues, and you could just have these conversations. I think it's like, it's amazing how much kind of elites have convinced themselves that not only are their very conventional views actually courageous, heterodox thinking, but that the people that they are disagreeing with are unwilling to have a conversation with them, and they can't speak this kind of stuff, when in fact you simply can't.
Oh, absolutely. And that's, the problem when it comes to people making arguments about trans issues is not people who have genuine concerns, who not people who are like, I believe trans people should have all these rights, but I just don't understand X. I don't understand whatever. That's not those aren't the people who are causing problems. The people who cause problems are the ones who use these issues, who don't want trans people to have any rights, who want to roll back all sorts of trans rights, but then pick something. They'll say, no, I'm just really concerned about fairness in women's sports. It's like, I don't know about that. I don't know that that's your driving motivation here, that you really care about, like, high school volleyball, but they'll use that to make these arguments to kind of get their foot in the door to do something else. And we've seen this happen over the past few years. Think about how, a few years ago, all these articles were about banning trans kids from participating in sports. And that was the push of, all these states were trying to ban trans kids from participating in sports. And then once pretty much every state that was going to do that did that, they moved to, well, let's ban trans healthcare for kids. Let's take this another step, and then you've got places like Florida and Ohio that have tried to implement restrictions on trans adults' health care. So, clearly it's all of this, this kind of get your foot in the door and take it to the next step. Move that Overton window, because if 5 years ago you said, I want to restrict healthcare for trans adults, that would be seen as an unbelievably extreme view. But that's what Florida did, and no one seems to really notice. It doesn't get talked about. It doesn't get coverage in the paper. The New York Times is not sending reporters down to Florida every week to talk to trans adults who suddenly had their health care taken away. They probably should, but that's not what they're doing because it's not interesting to them. It's not, it's seen as, well, those trans adults, they're activists and oh, they want health care? Yeah, they would. The contrarian take is actually it's good to limit health care. We should adopt the Republicans' point of view on this. These are just bog standard center right views, in a lot of the cases, but they like to pretend that this is some forbidden knowledge that, oh, you can't say this. It's like, then why is everyone saying this in a newspaper or on TV? Or, they have these platforms that are far bigger than what I have. And they're saying all the things that they say that you can't say. It's exhausting, and I know that, people have made jokes about that, about how, oh, this forbidden knowledge that you can't say. And then you just, you get the biggest platform, you get a best-selling book saying what you're supposedly not allowed to say, which proves just that a lot of people are saying what you're saying and agreeing with you. And you're not appealing to some thought that the public just can't wrap their heads around. You're on the side of the corporate media, the editors and producers,
Yeah, Pamela Paul gets paid well to write the stuff that you're not allowed to say from the most prominent media perch one can have in the country. I suspect a large part of this and of the not willing to cover how extreme some of this stuff is. And so I used to work in libertarian public policy circles, and one of my frustrations with watching those circles over the last several years is, say, that the silence about the restrictions on healthcare and healthcare for adults, like government stepping in to intervene in private healthcare decisions, is like the bread and butter of libertarians. That's like the thing that they get mad about and should get mad about. But when it's this, it's silence largely, or it sometimes is unfortunately supportive of this stuff. I think part of it is there was a time when the Republican Party, you could tell yourself a story that the differences were just policy differences, and maybe call this the Reagan through Paul Ryan time. And I think there's a lot of ways that story was not true. There was a lot more extremism among even mainstream Republican Party than people like to remember. But you could tell yourself a story that it was the center right and the center left having debates about marginal tax rates. And so the people on the other side might disagree with you on marginal tax rates, but these were reasonable policy discussions and should stay at the level of policy. And that created a culture of both sidesing. Both sides have some good points. Both sides have some bad points. And the way that you signaled intellectual seriousness, objectivity, and call it above the frayness was to be equally critical of both sides. And there's something to that. It is the case that even in those halcyon days, the Republicans had some policies that were good and some policies that were bad. And it was the case that the Democrats had some policies that were good and their fair share of policies that were bad and harmful. And so you could find, if you wanted to be an equal opportunity critic, you could find lots of principled good reasons to be critical of policies coming from either side. But that has shifted. So the Democrats still have lots of bad policies that I don't support, but the Republicans tried to overthrow the peaceful transfer of power, are empowering groups like Moms for Liberty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They have become extreme in a way that, we thought was kind of behind us with the collapse of the John Birch Society. But I think that culture of the way you signal seriousness is to just constantly talk of threats to liberty from both the left and the right, is has stuck, and it's hard for people to dig themselves out of it. And so I don't think it's just that, Florida's not happening near us, and so we're not paying attention to it, but that kind of pointing out how bad the right has become clashes with this internalized notion of what it means to be an objective journalist, an objective analyst, an objective participant in politics. And so that's how you get to, yes, they quoted Hitler a bunch of times, but it was kind of a like youthful and adorable mistake sort of position. Or that, we can ignore interventions in banning of healthcare, pulling adopted children away from their adoptive families, like really horrific stuff. But I think admitting how bad it's gotten means to some extent giving up that idea of objectivity. Like Biden's rhetoric in his campaign got a lot of flack for pointing out just how dangerous a second Trump administration would be. That it was like it was histrionics to say this is, the would be the potential. It would definitely be an authoritarian regime or one that would attempt to do so. It would likely be a proto-fascist or fascist regime or something that would attempt to be that. This is like seen as unserious. And I think the culture war is where a lot of that manifests, because it's easy to just then say, oh, well, these are just like cultural disagreements.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And one example of this sort of both sidesing that I was writing about this morning as we were before we recorded this was, there was that incident that happened at Arlington National Cemetery last week or the week before. I can't. Time is difficult. The way that it's been framed by the New York Times and the Washington Post it's a pretty clear-cut scandal for the Trump campaign. It should be, at least, but the Washington Post ran a headline with "Boost from grieving families, Trump sharpens attacks on Harris." And the New York Times ran a headline that said, "Trump campaign uses statements from Gold Star families to attack Harris." Now, these are both, the articles themselves are also pretty bad. The New York Times opens up by calling it a partisan dispute over Arlington National Cemetery. When really it was Trump brought his campaign there, took a bunch of photos where he wasn't supposed to take photos, and someone from his campaign shoved an Arlington employee off to the side when they tried to stop them. And then afterwards, the campaign went and insulted that employee and insulted the army, and it was the whole thing. It's kind of sick to see this play out, to see this need to treat everything as though there are two separate sides, just because two sides will argue. These stories are put up as just saying, some people say that actually it was Harris who politicized this event, not Trump, and it's just absurd. It's absurd that that is something that people have to read and try to parse to understand what is actually happening in the world, you know. And I think that that's an example of something that is seen as, well, that's just, it's a culture issue. It's, you know, he went here, he says it was good, Harris said it was bad, both sides. You know, these are two sides, when really I think, or I would at least hope that, you know, 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, it would have been different if a campaign went and did this. I think it would be unthinkable for a campaign to go and do this at Arlington National Cemetery in the first place. But I would like to think that there wouldn't be this instinctive, oh, we need to treat both of these things as though they're totally fine. No, it's the response to a scandal. If your response to a scandal is to say, actually, the other side is the one there, that's the real scandal. That shouldn't be a get out of jail free card, but that's what the press generally seems to offer up. That, okay, well, Trump said Harris is at fault, so we're going to run some stories saying Harris might be at fault. Who knows? You know, and it just gets really frustrating to, you know, as someone who criticizes media and wants the press to do better, to be more accurate, to be more thorough, to, you know, to take things, you know, and yes, tell us what's important that's happening in the world in a fair, accurate way that's accessible. You know, it's really frustrating to see, you know, as you said, you know, earlier you were talking about Pamela Paul. You mentioned her. You know, one of the things that she wrote about, which also was written about as a reported story for the Times, was this attack on the word women. She said, and this was back in 2022, I believe. And, you know, some people on the left want to get rid of the word women. It's like, no. I don't know anyone who wanted to do that, you know. And this was all over, you know, these small arguments over, in certain cases, you know, a trans man who gives birth might not want to be called a mother, or something like that, where it's just like, hey, just be mindful of, you know, the context of the words you're using and when you're using them. And suddenly it gets distorted and treated as something that it's not. And I think that sometimes that's to serve a story, it's to serve a narrative, because you can't have it where one side is being extreme and then the other side is just trying to be normal. No, you have to frame it as both sides are extreme. So you invent narratives, you invent stories, you invent situations where Harris saying that Trump didn't handle the Arlington situation well is just as much of a scandal as the Arlington situation. You have to invent situations where, oh, the left is trying to ban the word woman, which, you know, was something that there were never any actual examples of that in the reported piece. I think that was reported by Michael Powell, who is very opinionated in his reporting. I think he's at the Atlantic now, and it's just very it's very frustrating to watch, because it's difficult to push back on, because there's you know, there is no public editor at the New York Times anymore. And despite the fact that when they got rid of the public editor, the whole point was, we'll listen to people on social media more. Now, when people push back on social media, they brush that off. That's just Twitter. That's just social media. We don't have to listen to this. And there's really no way for readers to express their frustration with how something's being reported or talked about. And I'm seeing and hearing a lot of frustration from journalists who are saying, I'm getting criticism from the left. I'm getting all this criticism from the left, and I think it's unfair. And some of it might be. But at the same time, the criticism from the left isn't entirely invalid just because you think that some of it is. Maybe it is a little strange that there was all this focus on Joe Biden's mental capabilities, but Donald Trump gets, the way they write about Donald Trump is as though, there was a Times article that compared him to William Faulkner the other day, with his stream of consciousness talking style, which I don't think that's how they would have ever talked. They compared him to James Joyce. It was really wild. So it's just kind of it's really frustrating to watch the defensiveness. I think from a lot of people working in legacy media. And I understand it to an extent. I understand the defensiveness because it's a tough industry, and the people who are left in it know that it could end any day. Know that there could be mass layoffs and they could lose their jobs, and all of that. And most of the people doing this, most of the people doing the reporting, are not the super wealthy columnists. They're just trying to do their job, but they see their job as presenting both sides as equally bad, both sides as equally good, with equally valid points, and equally bad. And that happens so much in reporting these days.
The piece that you mentioned, so this for listeners who aren't familiar with the story, Trump I can't remember if it was an interview or a campaign rally, told a story about how he does what he calls the weave, which is what he refers to as basically his incoherence in giving a speech, where he bounces from topic to unrelated topic and then back again. And he remarked that his English professor friends, which I guess I'm skeptical that there are many English professors in the Trump camp, having gotten an English degree and known a lot of English professors, but that that his friends had said this is the most brilliant thing they've ever seen. I'll just note, I read that article that you're talking about. I took that article as fairly critical and like a satirical making fun of him. I think it was subtler than it ought to have been, and maybe I'm being naive, but I thought that article was fairly funny in how much it was dismissive of Trump.
There were some criticisms in it. There were. It did get at the fact that it's like, well, it's hard to find the common thread some of the times. How does he jump from electrocuting sharks to windmills to back to whatever? And
if you were an English professor, you'd understand.
Yeah, exactly. I don't have enough of a command of the English language to get it.
The media criticism is interesting because it ties into like the dismissiveness or defensiveness in the face of it. Because as you said, it's understandable, but it's hard to know what to do about it. And it seems to be tied into not just like, I don't like being criticized, because no one likes being criticized in their work and everyone gets defensive about it. But it also seems to tie into these, it seems like every couple of weeks there's an argument about who's a real journalist and what being a real journalist entails. And so it was, the latest version of that was the Democratic National Convention set aside a lot of space for online influencer TikTok types and much less for real journalists. And the real journalists were upset about this because the influencers and the Substackers and others are not real journalists. And so it seems like there's also just this, like, we are this clique or club or guild-like profession who know what we have. Our J school training has given us resources for uncovering the truth in a way that you mere mortals who are bound up in your confirmation bias and all of the other failings of your logic and reason perspective are incapable of doing. And and so it comes across, the response seems less like, I disagree with the criticism that you have of the particular piece, or here's why I wrote it this way, or here's why when we interviewed Harris and Walls we asked these kinds of questions, and you might not agree with our reasons for it, but here's what it is. And less like, you can't even have a conversation with us because you don't understand the very nature of the work that we're doing. But that sort of, it's it's like a it's like an epistemic barrier in terms of conversation, that until you have, um, or almost, there's this idea in philosophy called transformative experiences, which is experiences that you can go through that transform your thinking so much that, like, your new perspective is fundamentally inaccessible to anyone who has not experienced it. And so, like, one example is becoming a parent. So people who don't have kids can think they understand what it's the relationship with a child is like and what it's like to have a kid, but you just really can't, because it's something that can only be understood through experience and transforms your perspective. Um, and it seems like there's a version of that too, that like being a real journalist is a transformative experience, and these others can't have it, and therefore they can't know what it is that we do. And and if that's the case, I mean, what do we do about all of this? Because essentially we've spent the last 50 minutes and 3 seconds um, talking about how things have gone wrong, how intellectual barriers to understanding, to progress have been erected. And it's not just this isn't just like inside baseball to journalism, right? Like, this is, we could argue there, you could say like that this industry is having problems and it's going to be bad for that industry, but journalism really matters. It affects a lot of people. It moves the needle in politics. Coverage of ways that people are being hurt can help to alleviate that hurt, or poor coverage of situations can lead to real harms against people who can't fight back against that. This all matters, but it seems like we just have come up with a lot of ways that it feels intractable. So I guess, to end with, is there any hope?
I think there has to be hope. Yeah, and just because, like you said, journalism is important. It affects everything. It's, speaking again as a trans person, what people know about trans people generally is what gets reported in the media. A lot of people don't know a trans person. So their entire impression, their entire beliefs, whatever beliefs they have about trans people is entirely the result of media coverage, nothing else. And that's it's something that there are not a ton of groups where it's like that. This is a very, very small group of people that gets a lot of outsized coverage. And so it is important. And I think that the hope comes with people seeing the flaws, the public seeing the flaws and pushing back and saying, no, this was not correct. This was not right. Your headline was deceptive. You need to do better, because a lot of times you'll see headlines that will say one thing, but then the article will kind of come to the opposite conclusion, and journalists will think they're very smart for this, for putting it out, for making their argument the way it is, while really what it'll come down to is most people don't read past the headlines, and it's journalists being kind of full of themselves, and thinking that, well, everyone who has an opinion on my piece must have read the piece, when really hardly anyone did. And that's why I always try to be as straightforward as possible in headlines. Even though way back in the day, I once upon a time worked at Upworthy, which is kind of the opposite of that, which is where I learned how to write engaging headlines. But I don't exactly utilize those skills too much anymore. But I think that there's hope, because I think that people are pushing back in a constructive way, because that's also important. You can't just say the New York Times is fake news and sucks and is terrible and needs to be thrown out, because the New York Times matters. The Washington Post matters. These are institutions that them doing a good job, them helping, as you were saying, coverage can change lives in ways good and bad. I think more than just, I'm going to cancel my subscription, it could be, frame these things as, I'm going to criticize what you're doing, and I'm going to say that it's not enough. You're not doing better. And I think that as long as people are still willing to push back on these, on what they see as unfair coverage, what they see as flawed coverage, these institutions that have so much power will be forced to deal with us. And as long as they're forced to deal with us, then they can try to shut us out, but those of us who criticize media will be a thorn in their side. And as long as we're there, I think that there's hope.
Thank you for joining us today. Now, here's a preview of the next episode of Reimagining Liberty, currently in early access for supporters.
There's a way of doing politics that doesn't look like politics at all. And that is being somebody in your local community that your neighbors rely on. You make yourself a part of the lives of people in your neighborhood, in your immediate vicinity. This is a way that we can build power. We can build our own political power, because eventually, in election season, as you say, every 4 years or every 2 years, as the case may be, that becomes an opportunity for these interactions that we cultivate with people in our immediate social milieu to become suffused with political content. In other words, we have a social connection with people, and then we talk politics when politics becomes an issue in our moment. And that's when somebody might actually listen to you. Political persuasion, which we study in political science, is very, very hard. It's very hard to change people's minds about things. In part because if somebody comes and knocks on your door, you don't know who they are. You don't know whether they're trustworthy. In many cases, you don't know if the information they give you is reliable. But if somebody has been coming to your house and chatting with you on a daily basis, and they're your neighbor and they live right over there, and then they tell you something about politics and you have some reason to trust them because you've built a basis of social trust with them, there's a way of understanding that type of thing as a kind of politics, as a type of attempting to build power. That might be a way of thinking about democracy as a kind of social form, as a way that we organize our social lives, that we, through our ordinary interactions with other people, we build up connections. We don't have to hive off politics categorically from these connections, that it's okay to have that be a part of that, and it doesn't have to be something that divides us necessarily. I think that's one of the things that in these days of high polarization and affective polarization, if we come to understand, we often hide our politics because we're afraid, that our neighbors won't like it very much. Neighborliness has an independent value, but also has a political utility.
If you'd like to listen to that conversation right now, you can by becoming a Reimagining Liberty supporter. Head to reimaginingliberty.com and click on Early Access to learn more.